Anya, how wonderful to see you again. Thank you for being with us. Have I summarized the situation of the US administration accurately, or do you think I've got any of that wrong?
I think you have described accurately the way that this looks to many people who see the United States leaving hastily from Afghanistan and within hours the capital falling to the Taliban. However, I think it's important to note that many observers would probably agree that this would be the scenario which played out in Afghanistan, whether or not the United States had left 5 years ago, 5 days ago, 5 months ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago. Pick a date during the occupation, and this likely would have been the scenario. That's why I'm thinking about how now in 2012, whistleblower Danny Davis, a colonel in the U.S. military, came forward and said the U.S. public was being lied to, that Congress was actually being lied to, that military elites were lying to elected officials here in Washington, D.C. about the war, about the prospects the United States could win a war that was ill-defined. And I just wanted to read a quote that he actually gave The Guardian in 2012, because I think it just really highlights what we've got now. He says, people are not being told the truth, and what they are actually being told is that soldiers were being met with and killed in a war that was certain to be a bloody disaster. It's like, quote, I see in slow motion men dying for nothing and I can't stop it. It's consuming me from the outside. It's eating me alive. And that Afghan soldiers were going to be incapable of holding on to U.S. gains. This is 2012, George, almost 10 years ago. We knew this was the reality. And so I think the reason why now the situation has come to pass is that throughout the Trump administration, this was a #1 campaign promise of President Donald Trump. And he actually sent envoys to negotiate directly with the Taliban in order to avoid the kind of situation we're having now, where it's a violent takeover instead of a negotiated political solution. And we've actually published at the Gray Zone an account written by Gareth Porter, but provided by a top Trump official, Colonel Douglas Macgregor, who describes how, again, the top brass, the military command in Afghanistan, when it came to Afghanistan, undermined these political discussions. And that's where I think that's what's missing from the U.S. exit. We should have gotten out a long time ago. I don't think the problem is that Joe Biden is leaving. I think the problem is that the United States refused to talk about any or engage in any sort of political dialogue with the Taliban and reach a political or diplomatic solution. And now in U.S. media, which I can talk more about later, we're being inundated with the kind of manipulation. We had, for example, MSNBC host Andrea Mitchell crying on air when she was speaking with a spokesperson for the State Department, Ned Price, saying that, what about the women? I've been to this country and women are going to be, we're turning our backs on those women. She was tearing up. And these are all, unfortunately, ways that the U.S. public is manipulated into accepting, for example, the 5,000 more troops that the Biden administration is going to send back to Afghanistan, or send to Afghanistan next week. And you would have to be completely illiterate on the situation to believe that the United States actually cares about women in Afghanistan. That is, Biden himself said that was not the reason the U.S. was not in Afghanistan, to save women. He said that during his campaign.
Did this MSNBC journalist shed any tears for the women in Syria, for example, where exactly the same kind of obscurantist savages have been cutting off their heads with American and other Western support?
No, of course not. It's an imperial way of viewing the Middle East. And I wanted to turn attention also, since you were curious about how the U.S. press is covering this, I have the New York Times here, as well as the Washington Post. And on the cover of the Washington Post today, there is a story that reads that the U.S. warrior class is experiencing went from hubris to humiliation in Afghanistan. And it actually, there's a quote in the article that I wanted to point out, because they say that the Afghan reality wrecks U.S. architects' visions of democracy, as though, of course, that is what we were after in Afghanistan all along. And there's a quote by a civilian who served in the Pentagon during the Obama administration, and he says, "We know what happens when we fall to imperial hubris. What does one do with imperial heartbreak?" And I just thought that quote was so profound, because you have the Post framing this as an issue of empire, of the U.S. overextending itself in Afghanistan, the way any empire of the past may have told you could have been the outcome. You're not going to win. You're only going to lose lives and money. But this entire article, interestingly enough, George, is based mostly on quotes from a woman named Michelle Flournoy, who Biden actually considered to be his Secretary of Defense. She's the defense advisor who served in the Obama administration as Deputy Defense Secretary. And she, in the article, says that all along, since 2009, the U.S. has known about the corruption within the Afghan government, that it was really a losing war. And yet this same woman is the one who was the architect of the Afghan surge in 2009. So I don't understand how officials such as Flournoy are not going to be held accountable, or how they cannot be held accountable. It just seems outrageous to me. How many lives, how much blood is on their hands, how many lives lost because people such as Michelle Flournoy pushed ahead with this war, lied to the U.S. public, as we know, again, thanks to whistleblowers such as Colonel Danny Davis. And they're only going to do it again, I fear, George, because whether it's Afghanistan or a new battleground, these are always the kinds of manipulations, whether it's women's rights or fighting for democracy, that we hear, unless these people are held accountable. I mean, they deserve to be put on trial for the crime of the Afghan war.
Has anyone in the media asked the question, where did all the money go? If you spent between $1 trillion and $2 trillion in and on Afghanistan, why did it collapse like a house of cards?
What we hear is the C word: corruption, corruption, corruption. I don't think we're ever really, and of course, corruption of Afghans. We don't really ever turn and look at ourselves and wonder how it's possible. Why was our military training an army that they'd known for years was going to be incapable of holding on to the military gains that it made? And really, I don't see much critical analysis coming from the media. Tucker Carlson at Fox News did ask the same question I'm asking, which is, why aren't the people responsible for these policies being held accountable? I think he's an outlier when it comes to U.S. media coverage and critique of U.S. foreign policy. But we are it's so hopeless here. We have figures such as Andrea Mitchell. Then you have Meghan McCain, the son of late Senator John McCain, saying that her father would be so outraged if he saw what was going on now. She said he would be ragging in public and to President Biden about this withdrawal from Afghanistan. I mean, that's of course because her father, Senator McCain, was one of the most, in all of U.S. history, pro-war senators, someone who traveled to Syria, someone who worked to wage the war against Libya. And so these are the kind of figures we have. She's on a popular talk show that's not political, Meghan McCain. She worked for The View. And so if those are the kind of people who permeate throughout U.S. culture and media, I just don't think we're going to get critical analysis.
Of course, a lot of profits were made by the military-industrial complex. A lot of the top brass in the military that were sabotaging Trump's attempt to bring the war to an end that you talked about earlier. All that equipment, all those weapons are now in the hands of the Taliban. What could possibly go wrong?
Again, it's not surprising when you just consider that from the very beginning, all along, the United States directly created the conditions through which the Taliban came to be, through its support for the Mujahideen during the wars in the 70s and the 80s against the Soviet Union. Actually, as my husband, Max Blumenthal, wrote about in his book, The Management of Savagery, the U.S. actually went to Kabul and recruited the most extreme Islamist elements in the Afghan opposition in order to fund them and have them lead the war against the Soviet Union. And of course, at that time, he pointed out that women living under the Soviet allied government were saying, what's going to happen to us if these people are going to take over the country? And we know, we've seen how ugly that reality is. So really, no commentator based in the United States has the right to claim they care about women, or that they're surprised that these guns are ending up in the Taliban's hands. We helped create the Taliban through the war against the Soviet Union, and through the instability in the 1990s, the support for various warlords, which ultimately let bin Laden come into the country. And George, one point that I want to make is that I was very young when these wars started, but I remember, and still growing up in an anti-war family, in an anti-war community, there is no question for most people that the war that are already anti-war, critical of U.S. foreign policy, that the war in Iraq was unjust and was a crime and had nothing to do with 9/11. But there was a sense among some people, not all, but some of the more mainstream anti-war or critical elements, saying that Afghanistan was actually justified because we were attacked on 9/11 and bin Laden was there, and so we had the right to go in and retaliate against this attack on our country. And it's just ironic, again, when we think about the fact that bin Laden escaped Afghanistan in tunnels actually built by the United States during the dirty war on the Soviet-backed government. He escaped by our tunnels and went to Pakistan, was staying in, according to the official story that they even told us based on his assassination, in Abbottabad, a place where there was right near a Pakistani military base,
right
one of
door.
The country's most closely allied with the United States. So very strange that he would get out that way. And again, just shows you how the United States has been constantly chasing its own tail in Afghanistan. It creates the fire and it comes and tries to put it out, but it only ends up spreading.
Anya Parampil, thank you for that wonderful description of how it's all going down in the United States. Much obliged to you.